roads or paths or anything else. They were all over the fields and breaking through hedges and everything. No arms, they'd all gone. And clutching their throats and saying gas, gas, and so on.
We tried to rally them as they got level with us, and they wouldn't stay, and all we got from them was alley man, bomb, my lad. And they kept going, and we got orders to turn around and shoot them, which we did, run away from us. And momentarily we looked, and here we saw this green cloud coming along the ground.
The gas attack made a gap in the Allied lines 4.5 miles across. The Canadians were thrown into the breach, and for 3 weeks they held on alongside British and French troops and braved the new horror.
One chap had his hand blown off and his wrist was fumbling round, tearing at his throat.
The effect of this gas was to form a sort of foamy liquid in one's lungs and more or less in time drown one, if you were unlucky. Because a lot of the men died pretty quickly. Others were soon down, dying. They were in fact drowning from this beastly foam coming up from their lungs.
There must have been 200 or 300 men, and they were wriggling and wreathing in all positions, tearing at their throats, their faces black. And an RAMC sergeant, he stood by there, and he looked, well, I've never seen a man look so despondent. He says, "Look at the poor bastards," he said, "we can't do anything for them."
A young German officer wrote,
"The effects of the successful gas attack were horrible. I do not like the idea of poisoning men. Of course, the entire world will rage about it at first, and then imitate us."
This was the day when the last vestige of glamour and glory went out of war. Behind its ancient moat and ramparts, Ypres itself became a symbol of resistance and unstinted sacrifice. The great German shells set the town ablaze. Centuries of history crumbled at each blast.
But on a sudden, fierce destruction came, tigerishly pouncing. Thunderbolt and flame showered on her streets to shatter them and toss her ancient towers to ashes.
The shelling had started again in Ypres, and by the time we got up, marching up to the town, it looked as though the whole place was on fire. Buildings right and left of us were blazing away, and the heat was so intense in some of the narrow streets that as we were marching up in column of 4, the men on the flanks had to creep into the middle to avoid the blistering heat. And one could see the haggard desolation on their faces as they also surveyed the havoc around them.
The German attacks at Ypres rammed home the terrible lesson. This was a new kind of war, a war of engineering and chemistry and industrial power. The German successes at Ypres and in Russia had been gained in the Ruhr. Lloyd George, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, saw what the Allies were up against.
The Germans and Austrians between them had, even at the commencement of the war, much larger supplies of war material and more extensive factories for the turning out of supplies than the Allied countries possessed. And they have undoubtedly since made much better use of their manufacturing resources for the purpose of increasing that output. Germany is the best organized country in the world, and her organization has told.
In Britain, guns and shells were still being produced by a system designed for small armies and small wars. The main supplier was Woolwich Arsenal. Woolwich was an arsenal, not a factory like Krupp's, geared for mass production. By the spring of 1915, the War Office had placed munitions orders with over 2,500 firms in Britain. But there is a long gap between demand and delivery. Less than a quarter of what had been contracted for was actually delivered in time, and no attempt had yet been made to mobilize the whole of British industry. For Lloyd George, a crusader by nature, here was a cause. Soldiers were dying in France, and muddle and inefficiency at home were letting them down. On February the 22nd, he wrote to Asquith, the Prime Minister.
I sincerely believe that we could double our effective energies if we organized our factories properly. All the engineering works of the country ought to be turned on to the production of war material. While this process is going on, the population ought to be prepared to suffer all sorts of deprivations and even hardships.
On May the 9th, the French and British armies launched a new offensive. The British artillery had enough shells for only 3/4 of an hour's bombardment, and 9 out of 10 shells were shrapnel, useless to smash deep defensive works. Once more, the Allied soldiers opposed their muscles and flesh to the cruel lash of German steel.
Half of us were knocked out, either killed or wounded. And going across the meadow, there were a lot more killed. And we all stopped and laid down, trying to get what shelter we could from the tremendous rifle fire which was coming over. And then a sergeant just in front of me jumped up and said, "Come on, men, be British." We jumped up and followed him, and he ran about 6 yards and he went down. Well, we ran on about another 20 yards toward the German trenches. The German trenches were literally packed. They were standing about 4 deep, firing machine guns, rifles straight at us.
The attack on the Aubert Ridge had been stopped in its tracks. But the worst of the shell and gun shortages was yet to come in the offensive at Festubert a week later.
We were in a battery of 15-pounders, 4 guns, and consistently short of ammunition, being allowed 4 rounds per day for registering, etc. As the intensity of the battle grew to May the 24th, we ran completely out of ammunition and were left there absolutely helpless.
Silent guns, a mutilated army, spring hopes dashed. Yet all this was still hidden from the British people at home. In their censored newspapers, they read comforting accounts of devastating British gunfire.
At 5 a.m., the bombardment began. Then the infantry swept forward. The dazed German soldiers in their frontline trenches were helpless under the weight of the intense bombardment and determined attacks of our British men.
It was Sir John French himself, the commander-in-chief in France, who put an end to the conspiracy of silence over shells. He told the story of the shortages and their effects to the military correspondent of the Times. On the 14th of May, the truth was out.
The infantry did splendidly, but the conditions were too hard. The want of an unlimited supply of high explosive was a fatal bar to our success.
The reality of the war was at last coming home to Britain, as it had already to the French and the Russians. The reality of a new kind of war, a war of industrial might in which Germany was so far overwhelming. This was a war which France and Britain had hardly begun to fight.